Okay, so in the last little video we managed to get to a point where we've got, hopefully anyway, the Docker running locally, and at least some basic ideas of pulling images down and basically creating a container from those template images. So that should give us a little bit of a foundation. And in the last video, it was simply that we managed to run up a container from a base image, which was the Node 9.80 Alpine. And again, Alpine is the Linux lightweight OS, and I, at the time of this video anyway, was using Node 980. So there was obviously a as we looked at on the hub.docker.com, there was an image that had Node 980 with Alpine all pre-built for me, if you like. So again, you might find when you do a search, you know, there's probably a later version. In fact, I have actually updated since then. I think my Node version is now 10.15, so there's probably an updated version of that. So that's fine though. We can work with this for what we need for this demo anyway. So we had a quick look at, as I say, the way you can actually create or pull images down, which are templates essentially, and then creating runnable containers. Excuse me, sorry. And we were using things like Kitematic, which again, in the little Docker icon, you can see there you've got things like Kitematic there. We'll go into some of the other stuff later, but Kitematic, and it might need you to download that, but it just gives you a visual view of the containers that you've got already. So you don't need this, but sometimes it's good to have a visual look at things, really. That's what I think anyway. So that was great, but we were able to run a container, but it didn't really do much because it was just the base image. There wasn't any app being loaded in there. We could load a manual app into there. In fact, one thing that we're not going through in this video is when you create the Docker container, you can also create what they call a volume, which allows you to essentially, because the container is running as its own encapsulated, confined image, sorry, not image, but container, you know, it's its own sort of block. But you can create a volume, which means you can access it externally from your, say, your normal file system. And the reason for that is that you don't have to then, as you'll see very soon, you don't have to keep rebuilding a container from an image and updating it. You can, but if you're just testing for development purposes, you can simply have access, a bit like a shared drive really, but you can actually just copy your files in or ever script to do that, and then, you know, off you go. So that's fine, you can do that, and you can do that with the Docker file that we've looked at as well. But from my perspective, what we're doing is this is going to be using a Docker file, so we can do something called a Docker build, which is like compiling, I suppose, in a way. And the Docker file, again, we covered it briefly in the end of the last video. We're telling it which the from is which sort of image that we want to use as the base. So again, if we just flick to the console here, if I do Docker images, you can see we've got you know, I've already got a couple of images that I've created and built, but we'll ignore those at the moment. But here's the base one, essentially, and that again is where that from node colon specifies the tag name. So when you see, look, you've got tag there, this is the tag. So again, you might find you've got a later version like 10 dot whatever Alpine or something like that, and you don't have to use Alpine. It's just that it's a lightweight Linux sort of distribution, that's all. So that's where that comes from. Okay, we create a couple of we create a work directory basically, add a label, and then we do the copying. There's the package file, so if you're familiar with Node, or if you're not, it doesn't matter too much, but the package JSON says, well, look, these are all the bits and pieces I need. I need some dependencies. You can have scripts to start and run things. You know, all sorts of things. If you're familiar with npm, you should know what the package JSON is anyway. But ultimately, that's what we're doing. We're copying the package to the root, and then we're going to do an install, which will ensure that we've got the dependencies, and then we copy the actual application itself into the correct sort of directory within the image, within the container. We'll go through this a little bit more because it looks a bit funny, the dot space dot, but anyway, just trust me on that one at the moment. And then we basically say, well, look, from the container that we build, expose port 80. Now there are lots of examples of, you could have an internal port and then expose an external port. So, you know, you might have an internal port from your application that's running on 8080, but you want to expose it to the public as port 80. So you can actually do port mappings and things like that. But again, I'm making it very simple because my Node.js application is essentially going to expose port 80. Again, if you need to change this, you can. I'll make sure we upload this basic sort of demo application for Node on a GitHub repository shortly anyway. But essentially, yeah, we're going to expose you know, port 80 in this case. So that's what that expose is doing. And the final thing is the command, because remember in the last video, if we built a container from an image but it didn't really do anything, it would sort of like start and stop virtually straight away. And the way we got it to run was to put, when we did the run, we put a -t, which is it keeps like a console open, and that's how we were able then to connect to it. Using Docker exec, we could actually jump into the container, and we're into, again, it's similar to be jumping into a VM, but again, we've got an isolated container that we're using, not a full VM. So, and again, just to show, it's the classic picture that everybody shows with Docker, is there. It's the ship with the lots of containers. So in this case, the ship is the VM or the server itself, but you've got lots of containers which are essentially your applications, but they're running isolated with probably different OSs possibly underneath, different frameworks, all of that sort of stuff. So so that command there is going to run node, which is the command to run a node application, and the entry point, which is index.js, which is this one. Okay, now I'm not going to go too much into Node because, well, I'm not an expert in Node, and there's lots of great courses out there to do that. But ultimately, I'll do a little walkthrough just so you've got an idea of what the application is doing. And before I show you the code, it's essentially connecting to, I've got a MongoDB, so this is the document database. I'm using a free, I think it's got a 512K or a meg limit or 10 meg limit or something like that. But basically it's MongoDB Atlas. So if you do a search for that or go to cloud.mongodb, you'll be able to sign up and get a free basic MongoDB database. You don't have to use MongoDB. You could use Postgres, SQL Server, whatever you want to do, MySQL. Node.js can connect to most of the common sort of databases. But this is essentially a document database, and you can see that it's got a concept. You can create a database, but it's also got a concept of collections, which I suppose roughly relates to like a table if you're in a relational database world. Not strictly true, but it'll do for this example. And you can see I've got a schema which has got, ironically, 2 IDs. Forget that. My fault. I needed an auto ID, and I'd created the field and then created an actual ID field as well. So that's why I've got 2. So not good practice there. I'm using this ID just to let you know. So this is essentially relates to one record. So I've got a name, I've got an ID, and I've got an age. And also I've got a version, because the way that MongoDB works is you can version a document. They refer to this as a record, essentially. So you can see at the moment I've got one record there at the moment, and we're also going to be using, just to throw into the mix, Postman, which allows us to test things like APIs, etc. So we can actually, rather than having even a front end application written, we can use Postman to actually go and essentially make calls against the API. And at the moment nothing's running, so that's why I'm getting an error there. Okay, so coupled up with what we've just gone through, and I say I'll give some resources of all the bits and pieces that I'm using shortly, but the index.js is, we're using something called Express, which is I suppose loosely termed an MVC, model view controller type framework for Node. Again, not strictly full explanations here, but you can delve into this a lot more if you want to. Because it's sort of an API, I'm using a routes or routes module here. If I just have a quick look at that, you'll see what I mean. And basically what that's doing is it's using the Express router for Node, and I'm importing a service which we'll have a look at. But ultimately I've got several endpoints. I've got basically clients, which is get all clients. So for instance, if we're back on the MongoDB there, we've got clients here. Okay, my database is called NodeDB. At the moment there is only one, but it would get all of those. Okay, we've equally got then get client by the ID. So we could use the ID, which again, just very quickly, would be that there. Okay. Yeah, forget the underscore ID at the moment. That's my fault. I made a mistake there. But that's the ID if I wanted to get it by the ID. We can then create, because we've got a post, so we're creating a new client. We're updating a client by the ID, and we've also got a delete by ID. Okay, so at the moment I could just run this Node application locally because I've got Node. There. It's not doing anything. Control C to come out of there. So I could simply go node index.js, which would run the Node application, and that's what's in the Docker file there. Look, Node, and then it's basically passing the index.js as a parameter. The reason that I'm not doing that at the moment is there's a handy little addition called NodeMon, and it basically means I can run that, and as changes get made, it updates the server. So it's like a watch, when a change is made, it'll sort of rerun the application and things like that. You can get that from npm, so Node Package Manager. Okay, and again, if you're not sure about this, just Google that. But you can install NodeMon from there. Again, I'll give some resources in the sort of documents that I'll post along with these videos. But right now I can simply do NodeMon. I don't really have to specify index.js because it's going to look for that as a default. So that's the reason why I'm not doing that. So you can see there it's now watching for any changes in there, and again it's run essentially what the Node thing, but like I say, it'll update if I make any changes. So you can see at the moment it's running on localhost 80, and that's because in index there we've exposed port 80 as the port to listen for any requests on. Okay, so if I go to Postman, so this is running without any Docker at the moment. This is just running locally, and you might ask, well, why run Docker? But again, we'll get to that in a sec. So you can see there I've got localhost API clients, and that is because if I look at the roots again, you can see there, or actually in the index.js, you can see there I've got some middleware there that, don't worry, it's just modules that get loaded, but you can see it's got /API and then whatever the root is. Okay, so it'll be /API/clients or client by ID or things like that. Okay, so that's what relates to that URL there. So if I just go ahead and hit that, we should get a record back essentially, which we have. So that's that same record that MongoDB Online is using. And again, you can use MongoDB locally. You certainly can load, there is a MongoDB container as well. There's an official MongoDB container. So you could have essentially another container that you can interact with from this application that we're running at the moment. But I decided not to do that for this demo because, to be honest, it's just easier having a cloud-based database I can connect from several different sources. Okay, so back in our little application, that's basically running. We've got some data. I could technically, which I will do, I'll do a post. We'll create a new client. So the construction is localhost API client, but it's a post directive. Body, there's a rather humorous one, so chop chop, we might as well use that. So name and age, the ID gets auto generated. So if I go and click that, we should get you can see there it's actually pulled back what it's actually inserted, but the difference being that we've got the IDs basically back. And again, forget the underscore ID, my fault. I generated a field or a property called ID, but anyway, if I now go back to get all clients, you'll see there, if I do that, we should have 2 records there now. Yeah, there we go. So within our Node application, we refer to something like a service there. There's a client service. And again, I'm skipping through this. I'll post the code, but again, there's lots of really good sort of training online with Node and examples, etc. So, so if I have a look at the client service, it does a few things. We don't have to worry too much at this stage, but we basically include a model, which, because it's a model view controller. So if I have a quick look at that, the model is based on Mongoose is the connection technology to talk to MongoDB. Again, we can talk to MySQL, we can talk to whatever database. But essentially, I've got a client schema, and you can see there, look, I've got ID, which is going to be an auto-generated ID. The one thing I didn't realize is that it generates the underscore ID for me, but anyway, forget that at the moment. It's got a name, of course, and it's got an age, and a collection of client is called clients. That's what that's there for. And essentially, it will define that as client as a model. Okay, and you can see there it exports that out. So in the client service, that's what that model's doing. It's pulling that in. It's getting the connections and the connection technology in this services. It's then making a connect to the MongoDB, which is the one online in the cloud. And you can see there's our get client. So we do a query essentially. We've got a little bit of error checking, not anything fancy, but we either get the data back and return it out as JSON, or we get an error. And the same goes for if we're getting it by ID, if we're updating, if we're deleting, that type of stuff. So for instance, if I wanted to update this one, which I'll grab that ID, and I've got a put basically, which is an update. So if I just replace the ID with that one and look at my body, I'll take that out there and put yeah, Mr. Sensible. There we go. I don't know why. 51. Now I was going to add a separate property, but I'm not going to. In this case, they're the 2 properties that I've got. So if I hit send on this one, yeah, client not found. Okay, so